Welcome to the Cinnabar. Now there's an old quote that's often attributed to George Orwell. It goes something like this: people sleep peaceably in their beds at night only because there are hard men willing to do great violence on their behalf. Today we're going to pay tribute and say our farewell to a local legend, one of those hard men, a national hero. A fellow who grew up in this area, learning his stalking skills in these very mountains, and then honing them to a knife edge in the jungles of Southeast Asia, where he would go on to register more confirmed kills than any other Marine Corps sniper in history. A fellow by the name of Chuck Mawhinney. Now, I didn't know Chuck personally. He left this area shortly after his service was completed, but I do know a lot of people who grew up with Chuck. I've heard that as a youngster he was a pretty rambunctious, adventurous fella, loved hunting and fishing, even got his pilot's license while he was still in high school here locally. But I never got the opportunity to meet him, and I'm sorry I didn't. Heard a lot of stories about him, have read extensively about his exploits, and in fact, after his passing recently, I just found out that there's a book out written by one of Chuck's friends who, along with Chuck, chronicled his experiences, and I've got that one ordered, and I'm anxious to get a chance to read that as well. Now, growing up here, he was known as Charles or Charlie, and of course when he got to Vietnam, that's the term that they used for the enemy combatants. So he took up the moniker of Chuck instead, and he used that for the rest of his time. Now, after joining the Marine Corps, his superiors saw in Chuck the traits that would make him a successful scout sniper, and so they sent him off to scout sniper school. Chuck spent 16 months in Vietnam, registered 103 confirmed kills and 216 probable. The Marine Corps has a high standard for confirmation of kills, and if they can't safely confirm, then they call them probable, but you know, it's likely that a high percentage of that other 216 were successes. Now, in reading about the things that Chuck said afterwards, you know, it became apparent to me that the work he was doing there was important to him, and not for the bloodlust of the kill so much as because every one of those enemy combatants who was carrying a weapon would potentially kill his fellow Marines. So Chuck took that very, very seriously, and it was all about protecting his fellow American Marines. Now, I once read one time where somebody asked him if he had any regrets, if anything haunted him about his service there, and he talked about the one thing that really did haunt him. He had his Remington Model 700. They'd issued him a brand new one, and at some point, and I don't remember exactly why, it had left his possession. When he got it back, he didn't check the zero, and on his next mission he went out and just flat missed an enemy combatant, and it bothered him greatly to think that that fellow that got away maybe went on to kill fellow Marines. So that's what it was all about with Chuck, was protecting his fellow Marines. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about his experiences. Those are all very well documented. You can read about those if you're interested, but there is one thing that stands out, and for those of you who know much about Chuck, you've probably heard this story, but at one time there was an enemy patrol coming the direction of their camp, and so his supervisor sent Chuck out to meet that patrol, and Chuck and his spotter set up on a river crossing where they thought that patrol would cross, and they were right. And in a matter of about 30 seconds, Chuck neutralized 16 enemy combatants as they were crossing that river. pretty phenomenal skill. And just kind of hard to imagine. Now, after Chuck completed his service, he returned to the States and back to a normal life. Spent the rest of his life right here in Oregon, went to work for the Forest Service, had a long career working for the Forest Service, raised 3 boys. His daughter still lives just the next community over the top of that ridge there. And went along minding his own business and not talking much about his war experiences until almost 30 years later, when a fellow that served briefly as his spotter wrote a book and mentioned that Chuck had more confirmed kills than anybody else in the history of the Marine Corps, and nobody really seemed to know that. So after that book came out, of course, Chuck got kind of in the limelight, which I don't think he was ever really comfortable with, and kind of went out on tour and talked to folks about his experiences, and was very blunt and unapologetic. I mean, basically said, I just did what I was trained to do in the protection of my brother Marines. So I think in a lot of ways, even though he had done so much, he stayed a very, very humble man. Now, it's impossible to say how many aging Marines have slept peaceably in their beds for more than 50 years simply because they had a guardian angel who used to stalk these very hills. Let's take one tribute shot on behalf of all of them and all the rest of us. And of course, we'll do it with a Remington 700. Oh. Godspeed, Marine.